Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast, brought to you by City Current and powered by Lipscomb and Pitts Insurance. This show shares personal stories and insight from those who are giving back and making a difference, so we can learn and do the same. We cover life lessons, business advice, passion, and purpose. Now here's our host, Jeremy Park.
Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We're in for a treat. We have a problem solver who's working in post-industrial cities with entrepreneurs, corporations, foundations, nonprofits, all helping them positively transform the places that they love. We have Josh McManus. We had a chance to see him here in Memphis with Leadership Memphis, and we're blown away with not only what he's doing, but his findings, his research, the tips that he provided. So we thought, you know what, we definitely need to have him on the ChangeMakers podcast. And so now we do. So Josh, how are you doing?
Doing great, Jeremy. Thanks for the invitation to be here.
Absolutely. So you yourself, the fun of this is we get to cover a little bit of your life story, but your life story is kind of all over the place. And between Chattanooga and Detroit and all these different cities, give us a snapshot, though, of where you grew up, and then we'll kind of dive into each of the journeys along the way.
Yeah, well, I think it goes all the way back to the beginning to kind of influence what I do today. So I was born in the fastest growing county in the nation, just outside of Atlanta. And then we moved to very rural Northwest Georgia when I was young. And the little town we moved to was a Goodyear factory. And that Goodyear factory made cotton weave that went into tires. And so the town actually lived and died by whether the factory was doing well or not. So I remember the factory stopping being a Goodyear factory, going out of existence, coming back into existence. And so the following 20 years of my career has been sort of along the same pursuits, which is when you have these places that were built around these industries and those industries change, how do you stabilize and actually improve the place and see an ascendant path in spite of this economic transition?
And so talk about kind of where that led you in terms of your schooling. And I mean, was this something that when you saw that at a formative age, you thought, okay, this is definitely the path I want to go down, and that kind of led to the college experience and then obviously kind of what you did afterward? Or was it one of those where you kind of fell back into it as you started reflecting later in life with it?
Yeah, it's something you really stumble into backwards. You know, I wanted to help people. I knew that. I got business degrees because my dad was a strong proponent of following in his footsteps on the commercial side. But I knew that my mom is an artist and somebody who is always helping other people. And so I was trying to fuse those two things together. Started early in the United Way system, learned about social services, then bridged over into the arts and creativity and fundraising for that. And with every movement, sort of learned about how a piece of the helping world worked, and more developed this notion that the helping world was not able to keep pace with the speed with which society was changing.
Gotcha. So where, when you talk about kind of the first step, let's talk about college. Where'd you go to college?
Undergraduate was at Georgia Tech down in Atlanta.
Okay. So you kind of stayed. Now, is your family still in that area?
Yeah, my brother's still 10 miles from where we grew up.
Nice. So do you guys have any sort of family traditions when you go back and visit? Is there anything like around the holidays or things that you guys have to do or just love to do?
Well, I mean, so Georgia Tech, sitting right in the heart of Atlanta, is built around a number of iconic entrepreneurial institutions, my favorite being a place called the Varsity. It's the world's largest single-site retailer of Coca-Cola, and it's greasy hot dogs and hamburgers. So that falls into the family tradition category. I think for Memphians it would be somewhere between, I guess, like a Dyer's and maybe what's the other, like Ernestine and Hazel's.
Like, that's good. You already know our spots. That's good. I'm impressed.
I try to seek them out. I did when I was there a couple weeks ago. I hit up Central and Cozy Kitchen or Cozy Cafe?
Cozy Corner. Yeah.
A Cozy Corner. Yeah. So I try to find those places that people would define themselves with, the places that are that are the same they've always been and remind you of that when you go back to them.
Yeah, some nostalgia. I like it. So, okay, so coming out of college, you talked about United Way. Talk about kind of your experience of, I know Chattanooga, Detroit is kind of where you are now, but let's start on the city hop, if you will, because you've had really cool stories along the way with what you're doing and what you've learned and the people that you've been able to meet and work with along those ways as well.
Yeah, so starting in Atlanta, I like to joke that I just have slowly made the trip up 75. United Way was great in that I got to go out to Southern California and also got to go to Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. area. But really, when I dug my heels into the city change work, moved from Atlanta up to Chattanooga, did a number of years of work in Chattanooga on a variety of things that culminated with something that we called Create Here, which was sort of the continuation of the visioning process and helping retain and attract 18 to 35-year-olds to the city, also supporting entrepreneurs. Then I met some folks in Cincinnati and Detroit and started doing special projects in each of those places. So I have never actually lived in Cincinnati, but have been a part of a number of projects there, and then spent the last 7 years in Detroit. And then what's happened from there is I get called out to share in a lot of different places. So turn up regularly in Pittsburgh and Jackson, Mississippi, and places like Memphis, St. Louis, anywhere that's sort of wrestling with the progression from post-industrialism. I tend to want to gravitate to.
So, on your end, obviously I can see, to your point, there's a lot of similarities between the cities. There's also a lot of differences and cultural and assets. What are some of the things when you're looking at these cities and you're kind of stepping in, especially from an outsider's perspective and seeing, okay, what do I have to work with? What am I looking for? What are the questions that you're asking as you're coming into a city, trying to figure out how to problem solve? I mean, what are you looking for? What are you looking at? What are the questions you're kind of asking?
Sure. Well, I like to juxtapose the hard data with the perceptual. And so first thing I'm going to go to is population trends and understanding the physical footprint of a city and a county, also what its annexation trends have been and where its population's been going, and not just the number on the population, which a lot of these cities see population loss, but the income demographics, the economic integration, a variety of factors that can show stasis for a place. And then I like to juxtapose that with the more perceptual, which is to ask people, and I blend both the sort of leadership group that you're always put in front of, so the folks from the cities, the counties, the chambers of commerce, we met each other at Leadership Memphis, those type folks. But the other reason that I go out and find places like Central or Ernestine Hazel's is I want to ask the bartender, I want to ask the person who is bussing the tables, like, what do they think about the future prospects for the place? Because when you push those two things together, it usually tells a story of the place in the moment in time and what people think and also what's going on underneath the surface. And then the third thing that I want to integrate once I figure those two things out is what the DNA of the place is, what the things are that it's been great at that have differentiated it over time. And I think if you've always been in a place, you may not always recognize that. For a place like Memphis or Detroit, the water is so important. The fact that it's a borderland, the fact that transportation and logistics have always been a piece of what happened there, going all the way back to, pre-revolutionary times. Like these were places that were trade ports before they were locked permanently into the United States. And then also what the entrepreneurial breakthroughs have been. So like, for example, in Chattanooga, it's the first place in the world that you bottled Coca-Cola. It's the place that moon pies come from. It's the place that Little Debbie's come from. So in the entrepreneurial DNA of that place is packaged goods. And that means that you have intellectual property and you have an investor class and an employment class that are willing to perpetuate those things that are distinctly in the DNA. And so I use all of that as a basis to sort of diagnose. And no city is exactly the same. It's sort of like history. I like the quote that says history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Like cities rhyme with each other. And so if you look at Detroit, Jackson, and Memphis, for example, those are the three most economically homogeneous cities in the U.S. right now. They have all three have a high co-location of folks that are living in a poverty condition. And so the situation on the ground in each of those three cities is not exactly the same, but there are a lot of things that you can learn by looking at the three as a group together.
Talk about, you shared some really interesting entrepreneurial ways that you were able, especially like in Chattanooga, and you kind of mentioned some of the things, and even with some of the other cities where you haven't lived there, but you've kind of left your legacy through some of these events and opportunities. Talk about some of the things that you've done that have helped kind of mobilize and activate. So in other words, you do the research, you do the findings, you figure out, okay, here's kind of a plan. How do you activate that plan? Because I think that's another thing that cities really struggle with is, okay, we've done all this research, we've gathered all this information, we kind of have an idea, but now what do we actually do to actually change the tide or make a difference? And you've done some very creative things.
Sure. So I'll try to pull you one from each of the three cities. So in Detroit, when I got there, looked at the population, you see population lost since the early 1950s, and you see the economic decline that's associated with that. Really, from its high point population, it's now lost nearly 2/3 of its base. But then you find next to the hard fact, you found a lot of sort of cultural resonance. So the New York Times was writing about Detroit, and you had a lot of folks showing up with sort of this curiosity of what's going on here, and it's abandoned. Does that mean that there are these inexpensive properties? Is it a potential place for entrepreneurship? And I actually arrived prior to the bankruptcy, but really at the point that, in some ways the city was kind of scraping bottom. And I think that, when everything's broken, everything becomes possible too. And so the intervention that we built in Detroit was a 3-year project, because I found all these folks who were showing up, and some of these folks were brand new. A lot of these folks were from Detroit, had gone away to school, were trying to come back home and sort of dig down into their hometown and be a part of it. And you had unlike other cities that are on the rise, you didn't have a whole bunch of downtown realtors that had postings in the window of buildings that were for sale. You didn't have aggregators of jobs that were showing, here's all the available things that you can do in Detroit right now. You definitely didn't have a co-location space for entrepreneurs just to walk into and turn their ideas into action. So we built something called the D-Hive, which is a storefront right in the old traditional retail corridor. It was across the street from where the biggest department store had been. It was an empty storefront, so we were able to work with local businesses to get it at an affordable enough rate. And it was basically a storefront for, if you want to live, work, or engage in the city, you could come through and get that. And what we found quickly is, while you still had 90,000 vacant properties, occupiable properties were very, very slim. So places just to rent and live so that we could stabilize the population were hard to find. They were, in fact, so hard to find that we started with a PDF and a posting on a website. We eventually had to put the available properties on a Twitter feed because they would go so fast. You needed them just to disappear into the ether. Wow. And we also started training entrepreneurs. So we started classes, a whole thing that's now called Build Institute, which is 9 weeks from idea to action. And there's now over 1,000 graduates of that program in the last 6-7 years, and continues to ramp up. And what's cool is those graduates of that program are mostly female, mostly from communities of color, and mostly folks who have been in Detroit all of their life. And so it's not just the new arrivals kind of thinking up things to do for Detroit. It's people who've been there for a long time, but who are looking to change their city.
Yeah,
absolutely. I dropped down to Cincinnati. We did something called Cosign there, which was helping small businesses that were on a busy traffic corridor. And we helped, there's something called the American Sign Museum in Cincinnati. And we partnered with the Sign Museum, with the city for permitting purposes, with these individual artists and these small businesses. And we designed blade signs which hang out where you can easily see them when you're driving down the corridor. And I think we did a dozen in the first round. So the artist and the artisan, these sign crafters, this museum, and the city all worked together to expedite the process. We created these a dozen beautiful signs. The Hale U.S. Bank Foundation was behind that work. And, you know, for a total project cost of, I'd say $100,000, you drastically change the way that this streetscape functioned. So on Black Friday of the year that we did the first round, we unveiled those signs, and it was a shop local event. And the before and afters on what the street looked like day one and day two were incredible. When most, you know, of these sort of Main Street block grant revitalization type things, you know, that do storefront rejuvenation, those end up costing, you know, millions of dollars.
Right.
For $100,000, you sort of change the nature of retail shopping for one place. And, you know, even more so, change the way that the people in the neighborhood were thinking about their place and the sort of sense of pride and reinvestment. So I've always been a big fan of that one, cosign. And then in Chattanooga, we did a bunch of them, but I think the one that was sort of the cheapest but the most fun was when the opera was canceled. We asked about, you know, how we could help, you know, the opera not be canceled. And the answer was, well, it cost $200,000 to make an opera. We didn't have $200,000, but we did have $2,000. And we made something called Hops and Opera. We found that it cost about $200 per person to hire the people that know how to perform the opera, to sing the arias and those sort of things. So we rented a piano. We got a piano player. We got this 5 people who sang these beautiful arias. We got a couple of kegs of beer. We got a mobile bratwurst truck. And we filled up our studio on Main Street with about half people from the neighborhood and about half these traditional opera lovers. And so, you know, for $2,000, we perpetuated the music, which we deemed to be the most important part in preserving the opera. But what was really amazing out of that one was the new folks. You know, you had kids running around. You exposed the whole new generation
Right.
to the music. But then the folks that were the traditionalists had never been that close to the music before. They were, you know, in the studio sitting right next to the singers. And like some of the ladies that were longtime patrons of the opera were weeping because they were just so close to the music. And so it disrupted everybody's perception of what it was and what it was for.
And they've done something here, kind of taken that same lesson. They call it 30 Days of Opera, but the opera singers with Opera Memphis will go out for free all over the city, and they'll just perform. And to your point, it's, you know, it's kind of short bits, but it's usually 3 to 5 of the singers. But, you know, to your point, they've learned by taking it out to the streets and exposing people who normally would never have a chance to necessarily show up at a big opera hall or the Cannon Center for Performing Arts or GPAC or one of those. To your point, they get a chance to see it up close and personal, expose a new audience, and remove that barrier from stage to seat, which many times can be, you know, many feet, or if you're way up in the balcony, you don't necessarily have a chance to see the emotions coming forth or that same impact. So it's been a really phenomenal success, kind of with that same lesson learned, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, So I came up in Atlanta around the time that the Atlanta hip hop scene emerged. And, you know, one of the things that was very prevalent in early hip hop was sampling stuff that came before. And I really think that turned into a gateway for a lot of us to be like, oh, well, you know, Wyclef just sampled Kenny Rogers, and who's Kenny Rogers and what was he all about? And so I look at this the same way. Like, it's not opera in the traditional purist form, but it's a gateway that invites you in. And one of the hard things about opera and art openings are that, you know, nobody wants to feel dumb. And if you've never been given an instruction on how a symphony, how an opera, how an art opening works, then you're not going to show up because you don't want to feel
You're
like
intimidated.
I don't know what's going on. Yeah. So I think these sort of interventions that invite folks to play at a level that's super comfortable, and that will eventually transpose some of them across, is very useful. And then I also think things just have to be updated. Symphony has had a great 350-year run the way it is, but I was at Disney not too long ago, and when you add smell and touch and taste to the music, it's far more interesting in my opinion. And so things do have to morph and iterate and sort of change to keep up with the experiential demands of humankind.
So before we talk about the corporate side, which to me was really powerful, and we'll talk a lot about that, give us one thing that you learned on your trip to Memphis. I mean, what's something that when you look at the cities and some of the things that you've done, what's maybe one just little kind of off the cuff tip or bit of advice or an opportunity that you see for our city here just based on what you saw?
So I was really fascinated with Memphis's, I guess, design layout and these sort of parks and tree-lined streets, and the way that the residential and downtown dialogue has a little bit of a disconnect between it. And so you're in the core city, and there's clearly residential there, but there's not like loads and loads of residential. And then you get out by only a mile or two, and then you connect to these greenways. And so I think the piece that I see happening in some other contemporary cities is a much clearer dialogue between those two. Is how do you connect the neighborhoods and the downtown with non car driven solutions, and increase the sort of dialogue between the two places so that they feel fused and so that their assets become interchangeable. And you're seeing this, the DeQuinder Cut in Detroit does this. It connects the waterfront to the Eastern Market area. I went to look at the Greenbelt in Atlanta recently. Of course, the High Line. Like, there's more and more of these sort of bike ped multi-use corridors that make the cities feel whole again. And so I think that's the part I left Memphis most sort of scratching my head about, is how do you increase the discussion and the sort of human interaction that's not car-based between downtown and the neighborhoods.
Gotcha. Where does that fall on the spectrum of density? I mean, we hear so much about creating density for a ton of different reasons. I mean, the services become more efficient. You build kind of from a tourism standpoint, there's places that tourists will go. You hear downtown density, obviously, but even for us, you've got Overton Square, Shelby Farms. There's certain areas that will be great tourist draw, but the more you can build some density, and when I say density, it's having some retail, restaurants, amenities, concerts, I mean, things that really will drive, to your point, people to come out and enjoy the collaborative opportunity together, enjoy open spaces, but basically kind of be together. And to your point, though, then it's also a little bit of separation between residential and downtown and commercial. Where does density fall in your equation of just trying to build that up, especially for, like we were talking about Detroit and having a kind of an entry point in for entrepreneurs, creating density for that group to then go out, learn from each other, and expand?
Yeah. So, what happens in these cities is they de-densify over time. And so Detroit's clearly de-densified. The recommended strategy, that I have is nodes and stitching. So you take places where you can get a critical mass of residential density, and strengthen those as cities within cities. So when I say cities within cities, something that has enough services to support itself. So can I get my basic groceries? If I need dry cleaning because I wear a uniform, can I get that done? Whatever I can get within a walkable, bikeable distance, and then figure out how many of those you have, how many of those cities within cities, and then use corridors to stitch those together. So to make the corridors, hopefully walkable, activated, and that the corridors pull you with throughput, that you're like, they have a natural magnetism that you'd want to go from one place to the next.
Gotcha.
But you can cheat a little bit with, in a temporary nature with the the tourism side, and we certainly had to do that in Chattanooga, and that's going on in Detroit right now too. But the only thing that'll really support and sustain long-term healthy community is residential density. It's funny, I also have to spend a fair amount of time in New York right now, in the city, and there's a real question about the bodegas going away and some all of these sort of investment type properties. So you've got these super expensive properties that people only live in 1 or 2 months out of the year. And you see the distinctive street life going away, the bodegas going away, the cool coffee shop going away, the distinctive retailer going away. Now, what's fascinating is that real estate price in large part went up because of the amazing quality of life that it originally offered. So I'm getting pretty bearish on Manhattan real estate because of the erosion of street life, of the erosion of retail and restaurants that's happening. So I think you have to, in the long term, really work to make sure that people live in places 24/7, 365.
Right.
The tourism crowd and the conference crowd, like all of that is good as a stopgap measure, and you can get some tax money from it, and it can give your restaurants, some of them, a lift. But what you really need is people living together. The data also, plays out that that's much better for everybody involved. People living densely together, especially in ways that are economically integrated, it helps your happiness, regardless of who you are. People do enjoy being around other people. And for kids, the best pathways to prosperity come in places that are economically integrated. So places where everybody can live and you can actually find pathways to upward mobility. So it's fascinating in that it's a very virtuous cycle that these healthy communities that are dense, that are economically integrated, they make people feel better, and they also make people do better.
Wow. There's so much to this. I mean, that's what's to me so fascinating. Let's switch over and talk about the corporate side, because that was a very clear part of your presentation, was getting corporations more involved. So when you look at the philanthropy, using that corporate cause, that purpose to really drive in change, but also too, I mean, you did a very good job of showcasing how that purpose, how that effort to be more involved philanthropically will also create more profits and more opportunities for the company. So in other words, it's a very good investment to be investing in the community. Share with us kind of you talked a lot about individual giving, foundation giving, corporate giving, and kind of how those matched up. And then, like I said, you made the case for corporations to be a lot more involved. So share a little bit kind of that baseline context, and then we'll dive into some of the tips.
Sure. So this all comes from all of those projects that I've done over the last 20 years. Most of that was done either out of a 501c3 nonprofit or through my work with foundations. And what I realized over time is money to do the transformative work of building better cities is really hard to come by, especially when it's sort of this forward-looking, projects like I named out, like Hops and Opera, or Cosign or Beehive are not exactly, they're not feeding the homeless or housing the homeless. And so that money is super hard to find, even though those projects tend to lead to things that create economic independence, that help people build new companies and small businesses that then support other people. So it's a pull system economically. It ultimately has good outcomes, but that money to support those things is very hard to find. And what I realized is, if you look at all of the corporate philanthropy we have in the United States, which is, I think it's 58 billion, and all of so you take all the foundation money, one of them's 55 and one of them's 58, all the foundation, all the corporation money, then you come up with $113 billion. And, for a guy that's not ever had anything like that in his bank account, I'm like, well, that's a lot of money. But then you juxtapose it with a $16 trillion GDP for the U.S., and you realize, oh wow, that's like what, 0.1%. And then even worse is when you look inside that 113 billion and say, does all of this go to transformative work, or does some of it go to treating symptoms? In fact, most of it actually goes to treating symptoms. So then all of a sudden you're in this world where probably 10 to 15 billion goes to transformation of this $16 trillion economy. And then you sort of say, well, why would we ever do that? Why would we spend such a small percentage of our total resources for making the world better and for making the world work on exactly that? And I think it's just that we set up the system incorrectly, and that by allowing corporations off the hook by doing a little bit of charitable giving here and there, we've sort of set up the system that says, okay, all nonprofits are responsible for making the world work for everyone, and they just don't have enough resources to do it, and they end up having to spend most of their money to treat symptoms because people are cold and people are hungry and people do need basic services. So
what's interesting about that is, for us, even on our end, that's one of our big pushes is to show companies why it's in their best interest. I mean, to be driven by purpose. And when you talk about the engagement, it does lead to bigger and better things, even for themselves. And I think people then say, oh, well, if the company makes more money, then the individuals within that company can make more money and give more individually, because usually corporate philanthropy is like by far the lowest number on the totem pole when you look at foundations, individual giving, where nonprofits get their funding from. And to me, what's interesting is, yes, you can say that, but that's not always true. And so, the more profits a company makes doesn't necessarily mean that the individuals themselves will be more philanthropic. And so I'm like you, the more we can get companies to realize that they need to be a part of the solution, social impact is now mandatory, that we need them to be a part of that solution, then that's how a lot more good will take place. But it's not going to happen unless companies kind of raise their hands and say, I want to be involved.
Yeah. Well, the assumption of, I read a book recently that called it two-pocket thinking, that we make money with one pocket and we give money away with the other pocket. And the author was advocating for one pocket thinking, which is, this is all the same. Like the money that you've made and your ability to make a better world should be tied together. I like to describe it as we're moving from a for-profit to a for-purpose world. And in that for-purpose world, companies that know what both their moral mission and their market mission are distinctly advantaged, both in retaining, attracting employees, and ultimately in making higher profits. This is evidenced by, the top 100 places to work in America outpacing the S&P 500. This is evidenced by companies like Patagonia spending any available marketing money they have on basically advocating for the destruction of dams and the protection of the environment. Like, their activism is their marketing, all in the same, and they're more profitable because of it. I spent the last 3 years on an assignment where I went into a large family of companies in Detroit, and we had the two missions. We had the moral mission of stop Detroit's population loss, and the market mission, which the anchor company in that portfolio is a residential lender. So we wanted to be the largest residential lender in America, and we also wanted to stop Detroit's population loss. When you fuse those two things together, it's amazing what happens when you're willing to use the full capabilities of the company towards making both of those missions happen. It's a virtuous cycle. So the employees are happier. They know that they're doing more than just making money. The market responds because consumers figure out that you're differentiated from other lenders, and that you're not just, giving them a mortgage. You're making your hometown a better place. And you sort of unearth all of these other things that you never would have seen economic or social possibility in, because you're on this sort of shared mission. And I see companies left and right going in this direction because the consumer demands it. Also, workers under 40 are refusing to work in places that don't give them the opportunity to both do well and do good. Mm-hmm. this environment of radical transparency we live in too requires a certain level of accountability from companies to not just say you're doing good and not just do 1/100% of your post-tax profits, but to do something that's meaningful to leave the world better than you found it.
Share with the audience a couple of tips or maybe some of your favorite ones when it comes to how companies can find their purpose and leverage that purpose and be more involved in the community and what those first steps should look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think first and foremost, it's just like the DNA of a place. The DNA of a company would say that you have something that you're inherently passionate about. So for the folks I was working with in Detroit, they were all from Detroit. And so being party to stabilizing their hometown was in their blood. And so if I had said, well, let's help the sub-Saharan water crisis, they would have cared about that, but they cared more passionately about taking care of their hometown. So I think companies should be really clear about what is it that we know, what is it that we care about, what is it that we care about together, and to not be afraid to put a line in the sand. I see far too many companies saying, well, we need to do a little bit for social services and a little bit for the arts and a little bit for, places and a little bit for sub-Saharan Africa. And that spreading the peanut butter too thin ends up leaving a world that, everything is incremental. Nothing is really getting better. Nothing is seeing transformative change. So I think dig into exactly who you are as a company. And if you think about how many companies we have in the U.S. and around the world, if everybody takes on their one big thing, I think the world will be just fine. It's not like I'm not worried that, something's going to get left out if everybody picks their one thing. In fact, I think we'll be better off. And then as the ways that you do it, you do have to find that intersection of moral imperative and market imperative. And you need to be able to state both of those things. And even if you're a one person ice cream shop across from a park, then maybe that park is your moral imperative. Maybe improving that park, maybe having a donation bucket for a new slide for the kids' play set. Like that may be as much as you can do, but you need to be able to name what that moral imperative is. And then you got to welcome folks into your C-suite that are unexpected. This entrepreneur in Detroit welcoming me into the C-suite was something that was totally unexpected, because here was a guy that had been doing 20 years worth of post-industrial city change work. Now, I think I brought a perspective that was very different than everybody else that was there, and ended up becoming valuable because it was so unexpected. But you got to do it all the way at the top. You can't have something called corporate social responsibility that's tucked into the edge of the HR department, 7 rungs below the chairman. Like, this has got to live at the top of your organization.
Right.
And then you got to believe in the long term. The hard thing for publicly traded companies is they're so subject to quarterly profits and returns and reporting that they fail to look out at what the costs are of not being socially responsible. And with that, you end up not looking at things like your human potential balance sheet, what your people are worth if they're fully optimized and fully committed to the mission, and also your community impact balance sheet. Like if you've done good by the world, how is that impacting your sales? How is that impacting your ability to accomplish your business objectives, because folks know that you're doing the right thing? And then you've got to be able to use not just your money, but everything else. So in Detroit, we were using our government relations, our marketing group, our team volunteer hours. You got to be willing to throw everything you've got at both your market mission and your moral mission.
I love it. I mean, those are amazing tips. And a lot of those things we talk about all the time here is leveraging all of your assets. So looking at, do you have a conference room that you can lend others for free? Do you have camera equipment? Do you have, to your point, you aside from just your financial and your kind of human, your physical, your volunteers, what other things as assets do you have that you can leverage to make a greater difference? And, we talk about till we've blue in the face, we feel like, but that kind of sales mentality of, oh, well, if I do this, then there's a direct impact and I can get this sale and da 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 da. And it's like when you talk about investing in your community, cause marketing, all of that, you're going to be investing and investing and investing and might not see a return for 6 months or a year. But when you do, it's this windfall effect that's so much greater than if you hadn't been planting those seeds. And I think that's a really hard thing to get people to buy into, is this kind of, plant those seeds, give, and then ultimately what is created over time is something way more beautiful than you could have ever done before. But it's getting people to see that mindset of, okay, investing is good. And to your point then, when you can bring all the dynamics, all the metrics together, so to your point, CSR doesn't sit off on its own, you can actually see, wait a second, by doing these things, it's leading to bigger and better opportunities that in the end is making us more money and profit. And then all of a sudden, then from the CEOs, you've got that buy-in because they understand it's not oh, well, I'm giving over here and that's just altruistic and it has no effect on the bottom line. No, it has a direct result on your ability to hire the best, keep the best workforce, but also to grow your profitability. And so I think when they start looking at it as fully intertwined, then that's when the buy-in becomes huge and they can invest more and they can do more because they understand that it's in their best interest to do so.
Yeah. I think it's ultimately driven by belief. The folks that I've seen most successful at it believe that the more that the company gives, the more the company gets, and they go into it wholeheartedly. And it's easier when it's a private company. I do admit that, because publicly traded has all of these odd, Milton Friedman economics, single shareholder returns ideas that are propagated inside of them. But the companies that believe this actually deliver this, and they end up being the companies that we hold up as the icons of American commerce. Patagonia is like this, Ben & Jerry's is like this. In the New York Times, the Warby Parkers of the world. Even I spent time at Airbnb recently. Same thing there. Like they think of themselves as much a community as they do a company, and I think they're showing wild success because of it.
Let's go ahead and switch over as we kind of wrap up to something that we call our lightning round. They're just kind of short questions and short answers, and it's just a fun chance for us to get to know you a little better. And then we'll wrap up with your social media contact information and all that good stuff so people can reach out. But let's start with just, what's a recent book you've read?
Let's see. Endurance, about Ernest Shackleton's voyage.
And then give us a recent either movie, TV show. What's something that you've seen on either a big screen or a small screen?
I have to think. I have a 4-year-old, so most everything I've seen is of that.
Hey, this is exactly where we find out, because usually, like, I'm in the same boat. Yesterday, I was watching Paw Patrol, so hey.
Yeah. So I think our conversation this morning was about Olaf and Frozen. That's probably what's most recent.
Nice. What do you like to do to relax?
So I like to hike. We spend a lot of our time. My partner is from Maine, 5th generation. Our son is 6th generation, and so we live about a mile from the national park when we're in Maine, and that's my get out of my head space.
Nice. Where do you like to go in terms of, when you're not kind of working in the trenches with the cities? What other cities do you like to go to just for vacation and just to kind of kick up the heels and relax, or do something a little different? Where do you like to go?
I love these post-industrial cities, and so they are the places that I go to, given the chance and the choice. And I love to explore their culinary base. And so I was in Portland, Maine yesterday, and that was it's another one of these great sort of shipping post-industrial towns, and I was going through their culinary offerings, which was great.
So if we go to, we'll give you a kind of a fun around the world, if you will, but let's start with Detroit. If we're visiting Detroit, where do we need to go eat, or what's something we need to go and do? Here's your chance to put on your kind of tourism hat to promote the cities. So where should we go?
Yeah. Well, nobody in the Chamber of Commerce is going to tell you, but you need to go to Capers and eat steak by the ounce. So it's way up in the northeast corner of the city. and you can order as much of a porterhouse as you want. They will carve it out for you.
All right. What about Chattanooga?
Chattanooga, Seth Champion's Champy's Fried Chicken, which it's of the same kind of semi-hot chicken that you would get at Gus's for the Memphians listening.
Gotcha. And then you already gave us one, but give us another favorite spot around the Atlanta area with your family.
Well, I tell you, the place that I'm hearing the most about right now that I haven't been able to go, but like everybody who knows me is telling me to go to Gun Show, which is like Southern food, dim sum, wrapped into one, which I love. I love things that intersect stuff that doesn't make any sense together.
Yeah, I was about to say Southern food and dim sum. That's an interesting twist. I like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Where should we go to learn more about kind of what you're doing, but not necessarily your website yet? We'll talk about that in one second. But when you talk about books or just other websites, things that for someone like me to say, okay, Jeremy, if you want to learn more about city building and the post-industrial, how do you transform cities? Where do you guide people to find information to start? What books? Where do you guide people?
Yeah. Well, on the purpose and profit stuff, I recently made friends with a guy named Kyle Westaway, and he's written that book, Profit and Purpose. And he also has a Saturday morning email list. So I definitely sign up for Kyle's email. He's pretty easy to find online. On the city's work, I still go all the way back to the thing that inspired everybody, which is Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities. On actual up-to-date facts, a researcher out of the Northwest named Joe Courtwright, which is City Observatory, and Joe is a hardcore data nerd that goes against some of the prevalent thinking in cities. And so I really like everything that he does. And then, Memphis is home to the person that's been my strongest mentor and person I've learned from the most on this, Carol Coletta. And so whatever she's doing at the given moment, follow it, because it's always the smartest work going. I think right now, it's Kresge Foundation and the Civic Commons work.
Well, Josh, absolutely loved having you come on the podcast. Greatly appreciate the work that you're doing. Share with listeners how they can reach out to you, website, social media. What are the easy ways for them to connect to you?
Yeah, so it's funny. I'm a bit of a contrarian on public facing, just because I spend all my time in my work. But what I always tell people, I'm old school. Just email me. It's joshmcmanus@mac.com. And I'm the weird guy that'll write back to you, or send me a piece of snail mail, which is really my favorite thing.
Well, I don't know if you necessarily want your snail mail address out there, but hopefully they can email you and then get that. And then
shoot me an email, and we'll go from there.
Exactly.
Yep.
We'll start with the email. Exactly. Well, Josh, absolute pleasure. I mean, it was awesome having you in Memphis with Leadership Memphis. We greatly appreciate that, and obviously having you come on the ChangeMakers podcast and share the work that you're doing. And I mean, you're one of those that it'll be really fun staying in touch with over time, and maybe as you further your efforts and research and everything, having you come back and do a recap at some point would be great. But either way, thank you for all you do, and appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, and always love being in Memphis. So I hope to see you there again soon.
Thank you for listening to the ChangeMakers podcast, produced by City Current and powered by Lipscomb & Pitts Insurance. To learn more about our guests and to share your stories of others leading by example, visit us online at citycurrent.com. Connect with us online using @citycurrent or follow the conversation using the hashtag ChangeMakers. Now, think big, start small, and act now. Be a change maker.